financial systems, in fact, and how these work. Now, if we take the next step, and we say, okay, this is a nice closed network, and we are all extremely happy, but you decide that you've discovered that in the next room there's another network, and there are another group of people who are there very happily exchanging with each other using a different unit of account. They could be using the same one, but let's keep it a different unit of account. And you now want to buy something, an input from that other unit. Can you do it? No, you can't do it, okay? Because your credits are only good here. Your credits are no good outside, okay? And this is, in fact, where we have the first necessity, okay, of something, okay? We don't have to call it money yet, but we need something which is going to settle, okay, balances across different networks. Okay? So, in this particular case, we would say, we now discover, first of all, and this is why I would say what I'm trying to do is to get to an abstract idea of this external constraint. Okay? What have we discovered? We have just discovered the external constraint. The external constraint is the fact that if you are going to be trading with another network, a closed network, you have to have something else which allows you to do this. Now, one way of doing this would be to set up a meta clearing. Okay? I'm the bookkeeper here, there's a bookkeeper next door, and we now create a Uber bookkeeper. And the Uber bookkeeper does what? He keeps the accounts in another unit of account in order to be able to finance exchange between these two systems. Okay? Now, basically, if we think of Keynes' clearing union, this is what he had in mind. This is what he was trying to do. Okay? Why was this important? Well, it was important because he said basically if we had that kind of system, then the global system would function under the same principles that we just had for our domestic system. That is, there would never be a strict financial constraint. That is, as long as the Uber bookkeeper was matching debits and credits across, okay, the system could function without difficulty. Now, the gold standard system that we actually got was what? Well, the gold standard system was simply a system by which we linked different exchange networks by using a physical thing, a physical commodity, which was gold, in order to settle what we would call out-of-network transactions. That is, transactions across networks, where our debits and credits didn't in fact exist. Okay? So, if we now think of the way these systems function, I started out assuming everybody was part of the same network. Right? For most economies, what you had were small local networks. Okay? If you looked at medieval Europe, you had small local networks in terms of Florence. Florence had one, Bologna had another one, Milan had another one. So in general, you always had this problem of combining these local networks in terms of some, what we might call, some external asset. Now, the other point that we recognize once we have this idea of making cross-network payments is that there are a number of ways that this can occur. Okay? The first one is that by chance, it just happens that the debits and the credits across the two networks happen to match. Okay? Now in that case, we don't need any external thing, we don't need any external Uber bookkeeper in order to make the system work. Now, we know that in fact, this hardly ever happens. Okay? Balance would be a perfectly random procedure. On the other hand, if there is an imbalance, then what happens? Well, if you have an imbalance, okay, you always have this problem of being able to execute, okay, the discharge of the liability from one system that occurs in the other system. Okay? Now what is that? Well, I said that's basically the external constraint. Okay? Now how can we do that? Well, there are a number of ways in which we can do it. We can say, let's set up, instead of our Uber bookkeeper, let's allow for some market mechanism. That is, we can trade across these systems, our debits and credits. What does this mean? Well, it means that if there's an excess of debits or an excess of credits on either side, we have changes in the relative prices. And this is what we now call exchange rates, basically. Okay? Now, the problem with this is what? The problem is that if you're doing this in your domestic network, those exchange rates are going to have a dramatic impact, okay, on the incomes of these two network systems. In fact, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be transferring income across systems. Okay? Now, this creates a difficulty when we talk about these systems in terms of what we call monetary sovereignty. Okay? Our network system is one in which we are perfectly sovereign. Okay? We control our own trade, we control our own unit of account. As soon as we open that system to any external exchange, we've effectively lost our domestic sovereignty. Why? Because we no longer have control over the amount of incomes that go back and forth across these systems, if we're allowing prices to go up and down. How could we assure our absolute sovereignty? Our absolute sovereignty comes if we don't change, as long as we simply require everybody to exchange within our system. This is a system of what we would call autarky. Okay? We're perfectly self-sufficient. Now, there are some countries that are potentially self-sufficient. Brazil potentially is self-sufficient. The United States potentially self-sufficient. Russia probably potentially self-sufficient. Okay? You need a sufficiently large economy in order to actually impose domestic sovereignty. If you're a smaller system, or if you're a developing economy, you have the problem that it is very difficult to be self-sufficient. Or if you think of this in terms of the division of labor, it's very difficult to have division of labor only within your exchange network. You're going to have to go outside. Okay? Why? Well, if you want to accelerate your development process and you want to be able to import machine tools, capital goods of a higher level of technology, you're going to have to engage in trade. So the first statement says that if you're going to maintain any sort of sovereignty as a developing country, you're going to have to control your exchange. You're going to have to control trade. You cannot allow the market to do it. Now remember, I said in the beginning that whenever we have an imbalance on our current account, we have an offsetting imbalance on the capital account. Okay? The traditional methods of finance and development say that it really should be the capital account that drives your development strategy. Okay? If you take the idea that came out of the original decade of development in the UN, that developed countries should be transferring at least 0.7% of their GDP to developing countries, it means that developing countries, by definition, are going to be borrowing from the outside in order to acquire those goods. So the alternative would be to say, if I am going to preserve my development sovereignty, at a minimum, I would have to control capital movements into my system. Why? Because by definition, as long as you allow someone into your exchange network, basically what you're doing is granting to them credits in your system, okay? You are going to have to repay those. And how can you repay them? Well, these people are not part of your network, okay? You cannot pay them with your internal credits. You can only repay them with their own network credits. So this is the other part of that external constraint. So the external constraint, if we look at it, the way you get around the external constraint is that number one, the external constraint is a threat to your domestic monetary sovereignty, and you can only preserve it by deciding either to control capital flows into your system or by controlling trade with other parts of the system. Because these are things that require you to give up this very nice system that we started out with, in which everybody's debits and credits always matched, and we never had to worry about, well, money. Okay? Because basically, if you look, the definition of money is what? Well, the definition of money is effectively a definition which says that for any cross-network systems, you will need an external asset. Money becomes that external asset. We said, it can either be a physical thing, okay, or it can be a thing that's created by the Uber, or it can be the market that provides for that exchange. But any system is going to face that sort of problem. Now, from this point of view, it's interesting to look at the way we imposed financial stability, okay, on the international system in the Bretton Woods system. Okay? The Bretton Woods system said what? The Bretton Woods system said we're going to have a market. We're going to allow a market to exist between the debits and the credits of different exchange systems. And we want those to remain stable. Okay? In order for them to be stable, we're going to require each network to hold credits in the other system. These are what? These are foreign exchange reserves. Okay? Now, what happens if, as a result of allowing trade to be uncontrolled or capital flows to be uncontrolled, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to run out of those debits or credits. Okay? When you run out, what happens? Well, when you run out, you have to stop, because otherwise your exchange rate is going to move. Okay? So if you look at basically the impact of stability under exchange rate stability under Bretton Woods, it says that this imposes a limit, an effective limit, on the amount that you can import or export, or the imbalance of the amount you can import or export from other exchange units. Okay? So if you're a developing country and you have a current account deficit that exceeds your accumulation of credits or claims on the rest of the world, it says, sorry, you have to stop. And how do you stop? Well, we said the only way that you can stop is by doing what? By accumulating more credits with the rest of the world. And how do you do that? You do that basically by stopping the amount that you buy from the rest of the world, which means reducing your level of development with the rest of the world. So again, we come back to this idea that economic stability provides a damper or a limit on your ability to expand, because you've always got to meet the external claims by accumulating those external claims. Okay? So if we look at this system, we can say that basically, yes, we can always finance our own domestic development with our own domestic financial system. Now, whether it's a system that looks like the one we have now with deposit banks, or Schumpeter like very much like credit and discounting, whatever the mechanism is by which we create money out of nothing, And you'll note that when we started out with our exchange network, we didn't create money out of nothing. We created exchange without money. Okay, we did it in terms of our own domestic credit. We didn't need money or the formal definition of money in order to do that. So if we really want to do this, it means by definition we have to control capital flows or we have to control trade flows. Now, if we're looking at a development strategy can, as we said, function either in terms of domestic demand drawing in imports or in terms of foreign capital coming in, which in general requires the emission of claims of the rest of the world. So if we ask ourselves, if I'm trying to meet that initial requirement of providing employment for the labor which is coming out of the primary sector, maybe I should be very concerned with the kinds of imports and the sectors in which that trade takes place. So I should use some sort of strategy which allows me to build up a general manufacturing sector rather than vice versa. On the other hand, if I simply open my network to foreign claims, allowing foreigners to acquire credits in my system, they have those credits and they can use them in any way they want. Okay? So it means, in fact, we're leaving the decision on the sectoral development of your production structure to foreign entities. Karl Marx was a very perceptive economist for a number of reasons, but the point that I find in Marx's writings most interesting is that he points out that most primary commodities that are produced in Latin America are not indigenous to Latin America. If you ask the question, how many primary commodities are in fact indigenous to Latin America? This is a tough question, okay? I can come up with one pretty quickly. Cacao, okay? Potatoes. Tomatoes, I'm not precisely sure.
No.
Okay? Can we think of anything else? Corn. Excellent. And then there are all sorts of other things that are in fact indigenous to Latin America. What are they? Silver, gold, bauxite, lithium. Okay?
Also for people.
Well, so if we look at the example, what does it say? It says that if we allow foreign investors to accumulate claims on our domestic network, what are they going to do? Well, we already have one example, is that they're going to set up banana plantations, and they're going to set up coffee plantations, and they're going to set up all sorts of plantations, in which, well, Kregel told us exactly what happens when you become primary commodity dependent. Okay? Where did this come from? It didn't come from the fact that coffee just sprouted out of Brazil. It didn't come from the fact that bananas just sprouted out of Ecuador. It came from the fact that foreign investors decided that this is what was going to be produced, and this is what prevented domestic development. So this is where we get back to this idea of where does your sovereignty come from in terms of using your financial system in order to generate a productive structure that allows you to solve that problem of employment. And it comes from controlling, or to take a limit, I'm always an extremist, would say that you should never allow foreigners to come in and acquire credits in your domestic system, because by definition this means that you are giving away control over your domestic development. Okay? Now, let's say we've gotten way over time, and there's a whole bunch of stuff here I could talk to as well. But all I wanted to do is give you this idea, is that if we look at this idea of the external constraint, the external constraint comes from basically monetary factors. Even if we do manage to get our domestic financial system created, remember yesterday I didn't do that, today we did it, we got our domestic financial system capable of providing the appropriate productive structure. Even if we did that, we require an additional element. An additional element says we either have to control capital inflows, or we have to control exchange rates, or in the limit we have to control the services which come in and out of the country. And this is the real obstacle or the real impediment that is created by that external constraint. It's not something that we can easily get rid of, because it is difficult to imply any of these particular activities. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for engaging in this mental exercise of creating this internal network. Now, before we go to questions, if you think of the problem which is created by cryptocurrencies and digital currencies and payment systems, okay, you should see that there is a very direct relationship, number one, between cryptocurrencies, which are what? The equivalent of physical commodity currencies. They're simply substitutes for gold. Okay? This is why if somebody asks me, are you particularly worried about cryptocurrencies? I say, no, gold standard disappeared, so the Bitcoin standard will eventually disappear. Don't worry. Payment systems, on the other hand, wait until Apple Pay takes over your domestic payments network. That's probably not a very good idea, because that payments network should be run by who? It should be run by, well, either the society as a whole or its expression in terms of the government. Okay? And this is exactly the same thing which happened in the development of most systems, in that the basic function of the state was in determining the unit of account, ensuring that the unit of account was actually equivalent, and the things that we use in order to discharge those things. Okay, so as I say, beware of Apple Pay, but don't worry about the Bitcoin guys. They will eventually disappear, just like the gold standard disappeared. Okay.